Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is Sir Edward Heath's house in Salisbury. And so it's just facing the cathedral. So I didn't propose to talk about the house, I didn't know anything about it, just about Edward Heath. So Edward Richard Heath was born in Kent in 1916, and he's English through and through, and so many prime ministers are at least partly non-English. So he came from a middle-class family. His father was a successful builder. I don't know the name of the school he went to in Kent, but that itself is significant. He wasn't out of the top drawer, because when he became Prime Minister leader of the Conservative Party in 1965, he took over after three Conservative leaders who'd all been to Eton. So then he went to Balliol College, Oxford, and he was an organ scholar, but I think he was reading philosophy, politics and economics. And he threw himself into the Union, was president of the Oxford Union Society as the debating society of Oxford University. He joined the Conservative Association. So he was a very moderate conservative, and the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936. And unusually for a conservative, he believed that the Republican side of that war was right. So some like Sir John Stokes, his great rival in Alca, was on the nationalist side, and many people were neutral. But to actually take the side of the Republicans, which included communists, was exceptional for a conservative, and even went to Spain to signal his support for the Spanish Republic. So he thought that they should speak up for democracy, however distasteful some of the so-called democratic parties were. Anyway, so he was reading for the bar when the Second World War broke out, and then he volunteered for the army. He fought in various places. You can see a photo of him marching in a victory parade in 1945. So then he left the army. He was a stockbroker for a while, worked for Conservative Central Office, and he got himself elected for Old Bexley and Sidcup in 1950, quite close to where he's from, in Kent. It's the very southeast corner of London, a constituency he represented until 2001. So he had one girlfriend to whom he proposed. She turned him down. He never wed. There were all sorts of suspicions about his sexuality. These were the days when homosexuality was illegal. I don't know if he ever any strong evidence that he was gay. He was a friend of Ian Harvey, that Conservative MP who was cottaging with a guardsman in the 1950s. And Ian Harvey's memoirs are dedicated to those in peril on the sea. Now, Heath was a very keen yachtsman. Some people thought that was an allusion to him. So he held various junior ministerial posts in the early 60s. He went to Spain in the early 60s. He met Franco, and I read his autobiography. He said that Franco was cognizant that Heath had been on the Republican side in the Civil War, but considered it utterly unimportant 30 years later. Anyway, so 1964 the Conservatives lost office, and Alec Douglas-Home chose to stand down as leader of the Conservative Unionist Party. So previous leaders had just emerged from this golden circle, which was so lambasted by, I think it was Ian MacLeod or Rab Butler. One of those who were not quite as upper crust as the others felt that the sort of Eton mafia had excluded them from power. Anyway, in 1965, first time Conservative MPs voted in their leader, and they picked Edward Heath. Partly, in some ways, he was more of a man of the people because he wasn't from an aristocratic background. But on the other hand, he had the voice of a duke, and seemed to be quite distant. As one Conservative image maker in the late 60s said, we need to turn Edward Heath into a human being. His lack of a wife was seen to count against him, especially as the Conservatives said that the party of the family. But anyway, 1970, Labour's popularity had recovered from the crash of the pound 3 years earlier, and just on polling day it looked like Labour would win, but actually the Conservatives won. So June 1970 he was appointed First Lord of the Treasury, but it was sort of a damnosa hereditas at that time, because there were economic difficulties, there was a rising trade union militancy, there was rising unemployment, there was inflation. What else? So the Northern Ireland conflict was exploding, more or less, literally. So he had many different issues to contend with. He didn't really manage to master this concatenation of problems. So I won't talk through everything. So Bloody Sunday happened on his watch, 31st of January 1972 in Derry. One of his fondest ambitions was to bring the United Kingdom into the European Economic Community, because he said it was crucial to prevent a war and must be full reconciliation with Germany, or West Germany as of those days, not East Germany, the communist section under Soviet rule. So he signed the Treaty of Rome in 1972, and the Conservative Party mostly voted for it, and the Labour Party was mostly against, even though Harold Wilson had tried to bring the UK into the EEC only a couple of years earlier. but Wilson was against it because he said he disapproved the terms of accession. The particular terms weren't good enough about how much the United Kingdom was going to have to pay in and fisheries and whatnot. But anyway, as of 1st of January 1973, the United Kingdom was a member of the European Economic Community, or the Common Market, as it was usually known. The very same day, we in the Republic of Ireland joined, and indeed the Danes joined. But there were so many strikes. At one stage it was a 3-day week because coal miners were on strike, and coal was still a very important fuel. North Sea oil was only just beginning to be pumped, so there still wasn't enough electricity, and he felt that the country was being held to ransom. So he called an election at the start of 1974, and he asked the question, who governs Britain? Is it these trades union barons, or is it Parliament? Now, as people said, well, if you even have to ask the question, the answer is not you, mate. You're the Prime Minister, you should know that you govern the country. So anyway, the Conservatives got just more votes than Labour in February 1974, but Labour got 4 seats more. So the election day was obviously it was Thursday as always. The results filtered through on Friday, and as the Conservatives had just lost, you think that Heath might have resigned it immediately. Well, he decided to contact the Liberal leader, who was Jeremy Thorpe. No mobile phones in those days, so what he had to do was ask the police to phone up the police station in I think it is called Tainton, the main town in the North Devon constituency where Jeremy Thorpe sat. And then the police went and found out Mr. Thorpe and said, "Excuse me, the Prime Minister's asking you, would you call Downing Street as soon as possible?" So he did. And Heath invited Thorpe for negotiations, a parley in Downing Street. Could they form a coalition? So Thorpe then slipped out the back door to give the press the slip, and he took the train to London, changing at his Orme Court address and going to Downing Street for negotiations. But people were saying to Jeremy Thorpe, tell him to get out, as in Heath had been rejected by the people. So they talked about it, and the very least the Liberals would accept was a referendum on proportional representation. Now, he thought a lot of his party wouldn't wear it. Thorpe knew that the idea of going to coalition with the Tories was toxic for many of his party, who wondered whether they could get it past them. So they didn't manage to reach an agreement. So I think that Monday, Heath resigned. Very similar scenario to what played out in 2010 when Gordon Brown's Labour lost the election, but might have been able to form a coalition with other parties. In the end, it didn't happen. So that was Heath. So in early 1975, there was another leadership election of the Conservative Party. There's a lot of grumbling. He'd lost 3 out of 4 elections. Sorry, I forgot to point out, October 1974, there was another election with almost the very same result as the previous one, but the Labour government just about managed to limp on under Harold Wilson. So in this early 75 Conservative Party leadership election, a certain Margaret Thatcher stood against him. Now, she was seen by some as a stalking horse, or she was also the standard bearer of a certain ideology which she hadn't fully articulated at the time. Sir Keith Joseph was her icon, but Keith Joseph had ruled himself out of contention because a couple of years earlier he'd made some injudicious speech. These remarks thought to be infelicitous, saying that mothers of low intelligence are breeding too much and we shouldn't do that. And he came across as a eugenicist, people calling him a Nazi, even though he was Jewish. Anyway, so Margaret Thatcher stood, and if you see Alan Clark's History of the Tories, he said nobody thought that Thatcher would win, but we had to give her quite a few votes because if a woman does poorly, it looked badly for the party. And to general astonishment, she in fact prevailed. She was the party leader, and Heath was out. So the Iron Lady was in. So what then happened with Heath was the sulk for the next 15 years. He didn't resign from Parliament. He remained MP for Old Bexton Sidcup. There's some sort of chance to be brought back. Some former Prime Ministers have been given prominent roles, like A.J. Balfour had, well after Prime Minister became Foreign Secretary. Alec Douglas Hume in the early 70s, he was Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister. Thatcher, she later offered him to be Heath to be Ambassador to the United States, but he turned it down. It was a way of getting rid of him. The same thing had been done to the Earl of Halifax in the Second World War. Anyway, so Heath carried on sailing, conducting orchestras in his constituency, and advocating for Europhile causes. So when Thatcher turned against the EEC in the late 80s, he said that this is appalling. The EEC is a many splendid thing, and it ensures peace. It's far better to lose a bit of sovereignty than a son or a daughter. And when he brought the United Kingdom into the EEC, he'd assured people that it involved no loss of essential national sovereignty. It all hinges on that operative word, essential. But he'd been assured of the very opposite by civil service confidential memoranda. And years later, when around the millennium said, when you joined, did you envisage the single currency? He said, oh, of course. People say that's nonsense. Of course, well, if you did, you didn't tell the public about it. So there was a National Association of Ted Heath Burners around 2000, the website that I used to read. He was also an outspoken admirer of Mao Zedong, Zhu Xi, Chairman Mao, the tyrant of the People's Republic of China, one of the most prolific mass murderers in history. It was staggering that a conservative of all people should hold Mao in such high regard. So he had regular consultations with him. Heath was also against referenda. He notably didn't hold one to bring the United Kingdom into the common market, as it was then known. If he had done, it's quite likely that they would have lost. Opinion polls showed up to 2,000 people were against joining the EEC. Obviously, then Harold Wilson held a post factum one in 75 and carried the day, having turned public opinion around quite considerably from 2/3 against to 2/3 for. So, anyway, if people ask Heath, is it true that when Thatcher lost office, you said rejoice, rejoice? He said, absolutely not true. He said, rejoice, rejoice, rejoice. So he was openly elated that his nemesis had been booted out by her own party on the 22nd of November 1990. So he stood out of Parliament in 2001, and he was guest of honour at the Oxford University Conservative Association dinner in 2002, and I could have gone, but I decided not to, partly because I detested him, but £35 was a serious amount of money to me at that time. So anyway, he died in 2005. He's buried in that cathedral. Now, since he was being summoned to the Almighty, there have been these rumours swirling that he molested children and so on. Other people say that's bull, because from 1970, when he became Prime Minister to the day he died, he had police protection 24/7. Police officers would have seen suspicious comings and goings. But anyway, I mean, I don't believe the rumours myself. It seems to be almost part of the obsequies for any distinguished British gentleman that people start hurling mud at their posthumous reputation. So that is Salisbury Cathedral, because of course he was a great fan of ecclesiastical music, and he used to tinkle the ivories there from time to time. So he published a number of books. He was in demand as a consultant, and also judging art competitions in places as far-flung as Japan. In 1991, in the run-up to the Gulf War, he famously went to Iraq to mediate with Saddam Hussein, persuade him to release some British hostages, and managed to come back with some of them. So that is just a little bit about Sir Edward Heath. So please donate to me on PayPal. I really need donations to keep this going. GeorgeCallahan79@gmail.com. All right, toodaloo.